Right? Because when we went along with 1441, it was clear, we put on this program the statements of some of the representatives of your country, of France, that have said that they understood that there would be severe consequences. It is the feeling and the observation of many that they changed their opinion on this. And not only did they change it in what is viewed as a duplicitous manner, they went around America's back and were lobbying some of our adversaries in a means of hurting a so-called ally. That's the problem here.
Well, I think that's very exaggerated. I mean, obviously you're trying to pick on the French. I mean, and that's certainly you're entitled to do this. But remember that the French were not alone in this matter. You know, most of Europe.
France led the way. France led the way, though.
Well, it's certainly, you know, the reason it did is because it has the veto power, and that's probably one of the main reasons that it got picked on. Even though actually it was representing the opinion of a very large part of the world. Even 50 million Americans,
but the problem,
who, according to the polls, do agree with the European position.
But the problem is that, you know, when we go back, the nuclear reactor that the Israelis knocked out back in 1981 was there because of the technology and the deal that was made with France at the time. If you look at the government, if you look at the statistic, you know, France controls 22.5% of Iraq's imports. And I think we're going to get into Iraq and we're going to liberate this country, and we're going to see that the bottom line to France's decision here has nothing to do with morality, has nothing to do with taking a stand against evil, but it has everything to do with the economics of the situation, the desire for oil, and financial matters.
Well, I could throw those arguments right back at you, in the sense that everybody has traded with Iraq before 1991, the United States included, and many people certainly believe in Europe that the Americans are out there for oil. They're just as much as the French accusing the French of doing.
Because the United States, had we wanted all of Iraq's oil and all of Kuwait's oil, we could have marched into Baghdad at the time. There was nothing to stop us. And we could have confiscated those oil fields, and we could have done the same thing in Kuwait. But like in every case, America uses its military might, for example, to free the French from the Nazis, to free Germany from the Nazis, to beat back totalitarianism. We leave these countries better off than we found them, and we leave them with liberty and freedom. And there's a lack of appreciation that the American people feel. And this is a case led by the French.
Well, this argument is certainly one I've heard a million times, that that Europe, France should be eternally grateful to the United States for coming in World War I and World War II. And there's no question that everybody is grateful for that. But at the same time, you know, if you use that type of argument, why aren't you listening to us? After all, you know, we sent French troops in 1776.
Yeah, I want to thank you guys for helping us in the Revolutionary War. Thanks for helping us get here in the first place.
Yeah, well,
and also, thanks for the Statue of Liberty. That was a very nice piece of architecture.
There you go.
Yeah. I'm really amazed. I mean, what's going to happen? Are you concerned now that, in terms of relationships with the United States going forward, the relationship has been permanently damaged?
Permanently damaged, no. I mean, let's face it, now, we are allies. You know, we have our disagreements, but we also had our agreements. I think things will blow over and go back to the normal course.
You think it's just going to blow over? You don't think this is going to be remembered by a lot of people who have a lot of animosity toward the French because of this particular policy?
Well, at the moment, yes. At the moment, yes. And like I say, I mean, over time it will blow over, and because after all, we have a lot of common interests all over the world.
A lot of people see it differently, though. A lot of people think it's going to be a complete realignment of who our allies are, who our friends are. When President Bush said you're either with us or against us in terms of fighting terrorism, and that a complete realignment could now take place in terms of who supports the United States and who doesn't.
Well, I mean, right now, yes, but I think, you know, in a year from now, all this will be forgotten. The boycotts will be forgotten.
You think it'll be forgotten?
Yeah. People will not think about it. We'll stop boycotting, and everybody will be back to eating hamburgers and McDonald's or frog legs. Or
what role? Frog? No thanks. What role do you think France should have in a post-war Iraq? Now, one of the big debates is that France is saying, you know, we want to participate, but yet you're not participating in this military effort. So why should you then participate in the spoils of that?
Well, I think it would be mistaken to think of a post-war intervention as you know, to the victor belongs to spoil. I mean, I don't even think the American government believes that. The idea is to reconstruct Iraq, to give.
Is France willing to pay for that?
Oh, I'm sure. I mean, I'm sure they will, just with everybody else, in the framework of the United Nations. actually, I think the idea here is to give some luster back to the United Nations, which obviously lost some in this case.
What do you say to those arguments that the United Nations has really kind of fallen by the wayside? It hasn't stepped up to the plate, hasn't done what it said it was going to do, doesn't enforce resolutions, not just against Iraq, but a bunch against Cyprus. There was East Timor for years that had problems with Indonesia, and historically has not stayed on top of its own resolutions. And this is a prime example of that.
Well, I think there's certainly truth to that, but that doesn't mean you have to give up, because if you give up, then there's really anarchy all over the place. You still need an international system, and that's what's probably
But if this isn't
happen.
working and they're not enforcing their own resolutions, is there a better international system?
Well, let's face it, the United Nations is never going to be the peacemaker in the world, but it can certainly have a role in helping achieving the resolution of conflicts.
Yeah, Arno, let me go back. I just think, I guess maybe to sum up my position here, I think it's sad that in many ways I believe, and I think that many Americans believe, that France has put their economic interests above the liberation of an oppressed people. I think that's what most Americans view as very, very sad.
The enemy is Iraq. The enemy is not France. Okay, let's be very clear on this. I know some
That's not
media,
what I said.
especially your network and the New York Post, do not believe that. But I want to be very clear. The enemy is Iraq, it's not France.
That's not that. You know something? You're missing my point. I'm saying in this particular case, 12 years, 17 resolutions. He has no desire to abide by these resolutions, and France put their own economic interests above the liberation of an oppressed people, and that is a disappointment from one of your formerly closest allies, a huge disappointment.
Well, this is a very big mischaracterization on your part of the French position.
Well, it's not a matter of that. It's a matter of he signed on 12 years. He had a ceasefire agreement, 1 resolution, 2, 14, 15, 16, 17. And when it came to enforcing the resolutions and saying this is the last time, France was nowhere to be found because of economic interest, and the people that are oppressed are left hanging. And that's what's sad from your ally. Do you not understand that?
Well, if you remember the position, the French position, and actually a good part of the world position on this matter, it was that the inspections were working, and that if you let them
no, they
go
weren't.
on, yes, they were. I mean, Iraq was disarming slowly. I will grant you that. But
France is about to have the biggest embarrassment of its history.
Please. The idea was that the inspections were working. They were certainly partially working.
No,
and it was taking time, and that you could have disarmed Iraq slowly but surely without a war. And I think that's the French position. It has nothing to do with economic matters.
What should France do at this point to let the United States know that it really does care for this country? I mean, obviously there's a breach. What has to be done to bridge that?
Well, I think probably the most important thing right at this minute is that to lower the tone of the debate, and
would you urge people in France not to boycott American products as well?
And vice versa.
Well, right, but I mean, it's happening over there now too.
Yeah, well, yes. I mean, that type of situation engenders a worse situation, and I think the whole matter is very silly and it should be stopped because it doesn't do anything, doesn't help anybody.
What's your impression of Chirac?
Well, I think President Chirac is definitely the president that represents the French people, because after all, what this position is, is supported by 90% of the population.
Do you think most French people agree with what he's doing in terms of his lack of involvement here, his unwillingness to go along with the United States, his desire to veto at the UN?
Well, I think there's absolutely no question about that.
The total agreement in France?
Total agreement, yes.
There's
From
no
right to left, the whole political spectrum.
Are you serious? There's no disagreement. There's no debate. There's no people in France saying, we should support the United States.
They're very limited.
Why?
Because, my God, how do you answer that one?
Do you feel isolated?
You mean me personally?
No, not you personally, no.
No, in France, no, actually does not feel isolated because, like I said before, there's many people in Europe who agree with the French diplomatic position, in Asia, in Africa, and even people in this country. The polls say very clearly that at the time, 6 months ago, 50% of the American population was in agreement that this war should be resolved through the United Nations. If this matter should be resolved through the United Nations. Yes?
I got to take issue with one thing as we close out the show here tonight. You said the inspections would have worked, that they would have disarmed, but this is the problem. 12 years, 17 resolutions, and the final resolution said he was supposed to disclose to the world on December 7th all the weapons of mass destruction. He failed again, and we caught him in material breach on multiple occasions. You wanted to believe the lies, and we would refuse to go along with this scam any longer.
Well, that's your opinion. That's why we're in a democracy.
I guess that is. Well, one other thing, I don't think the French, sir, should play any role in the United Nations. You weren't there. You didn't enforce the resolutions. You didn't stand by the things that you voted for. And why should you play a role after?
Because I think that the French, as the rest of the world, believes that the United Nations has an important role to play on the world scene, and no matter how you look at it, even I think President Bush and Prime Minister Tony Blair said it this morning, that the United Nations will be involved in the reconstruction of Iraq.
You know, there's going to be a big debate about that. Many countries may feel otherwise, and I'm sure that will be something that will be debated in the days to come. Mr. Thiry, thank you very much for being with us tonight.
Welcome.
Appreciate your coming here and taking the fire. That is all the time we have left for this evening. Let's check in now with Greta Van Susteren, see what she's got coming up next on The Record. What are you looking at tonight, Greta?
Well, good evening, Alan. Tonight, the bombing of Baghdad, it continues, and it's getting bigger. Brett Baird joins us from the Pentagon with the very latest. Brett?
Hi, Greta. Tonight, more airstrikes inside Baghdad. The rolling air campaign continues to take out key Iraqi regime targets. Huge explosions lit up the sky inside Baghdad earlier today, coming from some key government buildings. The Iraqi Ministries of Information, Planning, and Foreign Affairs were told that huge plume of smoke that you just saw there, that was in particular one of the biggest ones. Defense officials now tell Fox, for the first time in this operation, a 5,000-pound bunker buster bomb was dropped from a B-2 stealth bomber as coalition forces on the ground continue to push closer to Iraq's capital city tonight. The cockpit view from an F-15 taking off for an airstrike deep inside Iraq. Massive explosions were seen and heard around Baghdad tonight as Pentagon officials say Iraqi command and control facilities continue to be taken out from the air. Defense officials say after degrading Iraqi air defenses, B-52 bombers can now operate around the clock at high altitudes above Baghdad. And on the ground, early this morning,
this is moving so quickly. When I was on just an hour ago, we were 60 miles from Baghdad. Now it's less than 50, and the fight continues. The helicopters you hear taking off behind us are armed Cobras.
Coming battles with dug-in Republican Guard divisions around Baghdad are now seen as the key to this war.
I think it's only reasonable to expect that it will require the coalition forces moving through some Republican Guard units and destroying them or capturing them before you'll see the crumbling of the regime.
Coalition strikes can be seen throughout the north, and outside the city of Erbil, the first 1,000 paratroopers who jumped in last night have secured an airfield and are preparing the area for a larger force and heavy equipment that is on the way. In Najaf, 90 miles south of Baghdad, U.S. Army forces saw heavy fighting throughout the night, unconventional fighting, with a mix of Iraqi Republican Guard, Ba'ath Party members, and Fedayeen Saddam.
A lot of engagements go on. A lot of tanks are hit by RPGs. I had one battalion that almost every vehicle in the battalion was hit with some type of weapons fire. But luckily, none of the soldiers were seriously injured, and actually all the enemy were destroyed.
The guerrilla attacks came from all sides.
Earlier, they ran a bus into the side of a Bradley fighting vehicle on purpose. The Army tells us they responded with a 120-millimeter cannon on purpose.
Central Command now says it's an enemy that is recruiting by gunpoint.
Iraqi regime forces are seizing children from their homes, telling their families that the males must fight for the regime or they will all face execution.
Wounded soldiers now being treated in Landstuhl, Germany, described the fighting as fierce.
We were told when we were going through in Nasiriyah that we should see little to no resistance. And then when we got in, it was a whole different ball game. received a lot of resistance. They weren't rolling over like we thought they would.
But on Capitol Hill today, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs General Richard Myers said the sporadic attacks by irregular Iraqi forces are not affecting the overall plan.
It's not having a major impact. In fact, it's not having any impact on the supplies reaching our troops, our forward troops, and we're just going to have to stay at it. Hundreds of them have been engaged. Hundreds of them have been dealt with, and that will continue.
In Basra, to the south, British tanks are engaging Iraqi forces on the outskirts of the city.
The Challenger 2 tank went into action, and we can tell you this morning that they've taken 14 T-55 Iraqi tanks out.
And further south, at the port of Qasr, coalition forces found sophisticated mines today set in the shipping channel designed to sink incoming vessels. Mine clearing continues in an effort to get tons of humanitarian aid into the port as soon as possible. The first aid has been welcomed by local residents, but military personnel acknowledge until the Iraqi population knows for sure that Saddam Hussein's regime will be gone for good, they still live in fear of retribution. And tonight, senior defense officials tell us 90,000 coalition troops are inside Iraq, with more on the way. Elements of the U.S. Army's 101st Airborne Division have now crossed into Iraq. And we're told tonight, Greta, that U.S. Marines who were hunting down al-Qaeda cells in the Horn of Africa have now been redeployed to help with Operation Iraqi Freedom. Greta?
Brett, what about Syria? I understand that today there's some question about Syria's cooperation in this war effort against us.
Yeah, senior defense officials say they are concerned with what they're seeing: military equipment, weapons, night vision goggles coming in through Syria. The porous border there, they say, is a problem for getting in weapons to Iraqi troops, some of those Russian weapons that we heard about earlier this week.
You know, Brett, we've always said that we own the night because of those night vision goggles. Very disturbing to the president when those Russian companies were discovered to selling them to Iraq and helping. What's the thinking at the Pentagon tonight if Syria is also providing night vision goggles?
Well, in fact, Defense Secretary Rumsfeld said he was very concerned with what he's seeing as far as Syria goes. They want to send a strong message to Syria to stay out of this fight and stay out of supporting Iraqi troops with any kind of equipment. They are seeing it on the ground and sending out that message today.
All right, Brett, thank you. Chris Klein joins us on the phone from northern Iraq. Chris?
Greta, we're about 10 kilometers north of Harir, the location of an airfield where yesterday and today some several hundred U.S. paratroopers, and we're told also airborne rangers, have landed. They are clearly advanced elements of what is expected to be a much larger force. Throughout the night, we heard the hum of helicopters, the roar of transport aircraft, as well as Allied fighter aircraft providing top cover for those transports. We expect to see much more arrive today. We understand that there will be a substantial logistics deployment today, as well as artillery and perhaps even light vehicles coming via air and landing at this airfield. The Kurds have provided about 3,000 of their own troops to provide a security cordon around the American forces that are coming here. And in due course, one expects that the Northern Front will indeed become an active one. Greta?
Have you seen any evidence that Turkey has stepped over into northern Iraq, into the Kurdish-controlled area, Chris?
For the time being, none whatsoever, other than the Turkish forces that have been deployed and have remained deployed in relatively small numbers in the de facto buffer zone of several kilometers that Turkey has imposed here since the end of the last Gulf War in 1991. We do know that over the course of the last 2 days, there were another round of tripartite talks between the United States, Kurdish factions, and the Turkish military, but thus far, in the course of the last day, the Turkish chief of staff says that the Turkish military will not do anything now unless it checks in with U.S. command first. And clearly, the Turks have been severely admonished and want to tiptoe very carefully around the United States.
In terms of the paratroopers that have come into northern Iraq, the 1,000, what type of equipment do they have?
Well, they're light infantry, essentially, very elite light infantry, as all airborne forces are, but they count on having small arms, the traditional small arms that all infantry units would have, but also shoulder-fired rocket launchers, as well as medium-range anti-tank missiles, light and medium mortars, even shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles. So the degree of firepower that they have as an infantry unit is considerable, but of course does in no way compare to what heavy armored forces would have. To some degree, the Allies hope to offset that with having pounded Iraqi heavy ground units here in air defenses so that they can enjoy not only air dominance but hopefully mastery of the skies. And one would think that the close support that Allied air power will be able to provide for these airborne troops serving alongside their Kurdish counterparts will make up for the lack of heavy weaponry on the ground. Greta.
Well, how about transportation? If they're the Northern Front moving south to Baghdad, how do they intend to get down to Baghdad?
Well, for the time being, beyond just a few helicopters that we've seen, a lot of these soldiers are footbound, but one expects that vehicles will be coming in via air. There is still a possibility, depending on what might be hammered out at this late stage with Turkey, that some vehicles might still come from a land corridor via Turkey. Otherwise, some of that transportation might be provided by the Kurds themselves.
And in terms of supplies for them, food, I assume that they have enough for the short run, but are there provisions made to bring some in?
Absolutely, and clearly the two airfields right now in northern Iraq that are serving as bridgeheads for this advanced guard of Allied forces will become very important logistics areas, and fuel and food and ammunition, medical supplies will all come by air for the time being.
All right, Chris, thank you very much. Kevin Monahan is aboard the USS Constellation in the Persian Gulf and joins us this evening. Kevin, what's going on in the Constellation tonight?
Hi, Greta. Flight operations are in full swing this morning. Sun's just come up. It has not been a particularly busy night until recently because of the weather again. The weather system here is the winds come from the northwest from Iraq and Kuwait, so we were sort of the last ones here to clear. Flights have been touch and go for a while, but now they're full swing again. Targets remaining the same. A lot centered around Baghdad. We've been hitting command and control in Baghdad, a lot of air defenses, and Special Republican Guard units as well. Also, it was 24 hours ago anyway, they hit an airfield in Baghdad. They're trying to make sure that the Iraqi Air Force does not get any of their planes up in the air. As you know, it's a very crippled, aging Air Force consisting of some very old French Mirages and Russian MiG, so it's not much of a threat, but they just want to make sure that that there's no helicopters or airplanes getting up in the air at all at any time. Now, it's very active still in the area of Al-Quds, southeast of Baghdad. They've been trying to get pilots out there as much as possible to give cover to the troops down there. You know that you've heard the reports over the last day or so of Special Republican Guard units trying to move their way southeast into the area, trying to cause more trouble for the troops, trying to join the fight. And pilots here, F-14 and F-18 pilots, have been busy over the last 24, even 48 hours going after those units. One other interesting aspect, Greta, is the last couple of days we've been noticing a lot of jets, or I shouldn't say a lot, some jets coming back, F-14s and F-18s, with their ordnance still there. So they haven't been dropping some weaponry. We've been talking to the commander of the air wing here today about that and wondering if it's just weather related. He said, no, it's not. Again, it works in with the whole scheme of things. They're moving away from fixed targets more to targets of opportunity and close air support. And when they're doing so, a lot more discretion is needed, is necessary by the pilots. They want to avoid friendly fire incidents. They want to avoid civilian casualties. And as a result, they need to really be careful. So fixed targets, they're going out, they're using their very sophisticated smart weapons and dropping them on the coordinates. When they're doing this close air cover and targets of opportunity, there's a lot more leeway. They need to be a lot more careful. And so a lot less numbers of weapons are being dropped, Greta.
Kevin, give me that. Is it around the clock that planes are taking off from the Constellation, like nonstop business?
It's not round the clock per se in terms of planes leaving and coming back. The carrier's working not round the clock because you've got people down below working on ordnances constantly, putting them together, bringing them up. The hangar bay is almost always busy. We're in the hangar bay right now. You've got planes in and out of here all the time. Huge elevators on each side of me, bringing jets, F-14s, F-18s, Prowlers, which are the radar jamming planes up and down. They are flying quite a bit, but it's not 24 hours. The carrier, however, is working 24 hours a day.
And do the F-14 and the F-18s, they own the skies in the sense that the Iraqi military seems to be non-existent and there's no one shooting at these planes?
They pretty much do own the skies. What they can do, as we've been talking about for a while now, is because they've got the smart weapons, they really can get above it. They can do what they want to do. There are very few surface-to-air missiles, guided missiles being shot at them, but they still are. And when those surface-to-air missiles, when those SAMs are being shot at them, they've got systems in place which protect them for the most part. I've been speaking again to the commander of the air wing here, and he wants to be careful about saying we've got complete dominance, because he said there's so much small stuff down there, and although the Iraqis, you can knock everything out, but as he says, quote unquote, the Iraqis never ever run out of bullets.
All right, Kevin, thank you very much. Actually, the weather looks a lot better than 2 nights ago when you reported it was 50-mile-an-hour wind on that deck. It looks a lot better. Thank you, Kevin. Joining us in Washington, D.C. is former House Speaker Newt Gingrich. Welcome, Mr. Speaker.
It's good to be with you.
Mr. Speaker, I want to start with Syria. Syria, who voted for Resolution 1441, and Syria, who is now, for at least senior military officials say, providing night goggles and other assistance to Iraq. Why?
Well, Syria is a dictatorship with a Ba'ath party. I think that down deep, the Syrian dictator is very afraid that once Iraq falls and begins to become democratic, the pressure will be on Syria to give up its terrorists. Syria's had a number of terrorist offices. They've supported terrorism in Lebanon. They support Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. So I think the Syrians have tried to do all they could to prop up Saddam in the hopes that they might slow us down or increase our casualties or convince us that it's not worth the cost. And it's something we should just all remember later on.
But, you know, it's so bizarre. Why vote for 1441? I mean, why? I mean, it's so deceitful. I mean, the level...
well, I mean, this is a dictatorship a lot like Saddam's. This is a dictatorship where it's a second generation. The father died and the son replaced him. But the families had a long tradition of running a very tough dictatorship. They once destroyed an entire city just because it had rebelled and they wanted to teach people a lesson. So a city of Syrians. So I would say this is, you know, you shouldn't expect dictators to do anything that's predictable. They do what they think is in their interest, and they don't particularly mind lying. That's the nature of a dictatorship.
All right, well, then let's go to Russia. And apparently a Russian company was also in the night goggle business. Syria's got a little competition there. What do we do about Russia if indeed a Russian company, I didn't say the Russian government, but Russian companies selling night goggles to Iraq?
Well, as I understand it, the president had a very direct, frank conversation with President Putin. And I think the Russians are now claiming that their government did not know what was happening, are not in favor of it, et cetera. So they're unlike the Syrians, they're backpedaling pretty dramatically. And I don't think the Russians want to get into any kind of real argument with us because they have so many economic interests wanting to work with us.
Do you believe that when a government says, we also, when France was suspected of providing repair parts for Iraqi fighter planes recently, the French government said they didn't know anything about it. Do you believe that the Russian government didn't know about the Russian company?
I think that somebody below Putin almost certainly did know. He may or may not have known. I think it's fair for the head of a government not to know all the things that go on in a big country. But it's almost impossible to have been exporting the night vision goggles, or in the French case, to have been exporting the repair parts, I think, for the F-1 fighter plane without knowing something about it.
You know, and people listening to this, though, I mean, and here's talking, must think we're a little bit crazy in the sense we have these countries who have said that they do not want Saddam to have weapons of mass destruction, yet they're assisting Saddam in fighting the coalition.
Well, I think what you have to recognize is that if you go back and look over the 1990s, Russia and France both consistently supported Saddam. Ambassador Butler, the Australian ambassador who headed up the UN inspections, wrote in his memoir that he was consistently undermined by Russia and France. And I think that the French have had a long tradition of being very close to Saddam. In Chirac's case, he first sold Saddam a nuclear reactor in 1973. The Israelis bombed it in '81. He then went to Iraq and promised to rebuild it. So there's a very long 30-year tradition of Chirac and Saddam, working with each other, supporting each other. The rumor is that the French government-owned petroleum company has a very sweetheart deal that if Saddam stays in power, they'll do very well out of oil. And so I think there are a lot of reasons the French don't want to see Saddam fall.
You raise Israel. People have been quite happy that the western part of Iraq has been taken over by the coalition, which was a Scud box. Scuds not thought then could reach Israel. With Syria getting a little bit involved in that, does that at all sort of pique the interest of Israel? Does Israel worry about that?
Well, the Israelis are very worried about the 8,000 to 11,000 missiles that Hezbollah has in southern Lebanon. Most of them are very short range, but there's still so many of them that some of them could reach Haifa and Tel Aviv. And I think they're very, very worried because Hezbollah is basically controlled by Syria and paid for by Iran. On the other hand, Syria knows that it has been told pretty directly by the Israelis that if anything starts, that Syria will be held accountable, not Hezbollah. So up till now, at least, the Syrians have really sat on Hezbollah during this crisis and not gotten them involved. But I think the Israelis keep a constant eye on Syria and on southern Lebanon for that reason.
All right, so let's go to Prime Minister Tony Blair, who was here in the United States the last 2 days. Seems to be interested in bringing the UN into a post-Saddam Iraq. Why?
Well, I think the British have a very deep commitment to the United Nations as an institution. I think in order to keep his Labour Party united, Prime Minister Blair has to indicate some commitment to that kind of internationalism. I just hope that we don't do anything in any form which allows the French veto to have any meaning. So I think we have to draw that distinction between those two.
And in terms of the war, as you step back, where are we headed on this? I mean, I know we're going to win, but what's the big picture?
Well, I think, first of all, the 101st is now apparently inside Iraq in a serious way. As you yourself were just reporting, you have an airborne unit that's in northern Iraq. My guess is that every night from here on out, they'll start air landing equipment. They'll have more and more equipment and more capability. You've got the 3rd Division now having refueled and rearmed, and the Marines having gotten ready. I think in the next couple of days, you'll see them grind up a couple of Republican Guard divisions and probably be on the outskirts of Iraq within 48 or 72 hours.
One quick last question. Should the surrender be to an American, whether it be a military or a civilian, or should we have set up a provisional Iraqi government so the Iraqis were surrendering to Iraqis?
No, I really think in this kind of, if a group of senior Iraqis had defected, if 4 or 5 divisions had switched, you might have been able to work out something like that. But I think it would have been very dangerous for us to try to create a provisional government outside of Iraq with people who didn't live in the country. I'm very much for people like Ahmed Chalabi playing a major role, but I think that's got to be part of a negotiation after Iraq is liberated. And I don't think that in the current circumstances you've seen in Basra, where you have the secret police, the equivalent of the SS and the Gestapo in Germany in the Second World War, those folks have been sitting on everybody who wants to dissent. And so I think it's better for us win the war, force Saddam out of power, liberate the country, and then, 6, 8, 10, 12 weeks afterwards, do what we did in Afghanistan, which is bring everybody together.
And let them
have them really work it out.
All right, Mr. Speaker, always nice to see you. Thank you for joining us. We go now to Greg Kelly, who is with the Army's 3rd Infantry Unit. Greg?
Hey there, Greta. Yeah, we're in the vicinity of Anand Jaf with the 2nd Brigade of the 3rd Infantry Division. There is still a lot of concern about these Al-Quds and Fedayeen militia. They've been fighting extremely hard, and they've also been dying in great numbers. They're using a lot of guerrilla tactics. We're told earlier one tried to drive a bus into the side of a Bradley fighting vehicle. Now, what is motivating them to fight this kind of desperate fashion? Well, one thing might be the local Ba'ath Party. There are reports, some of the locals have told military commanders here that Ba'ath Party operatives are taking women and children hostage in order to coerce the male family members to fight that much harder. Well, possibly in response to some of those reports earlier, the Ba'ath Party local headquarters was targeted in an airstrike. An F-18 dropped a JDAM That's about a 2,000-pound bomb guided by a GPS, global positioning system. It is extremely accurate. Also, they took out a surface-to-surface missile system last night. We saw it happen at close air support mission off of A-10 Warthogs from the Air Force. Overall, the unit commanders we're with are encouraged for a couple of reasons. Number one, they've seen a bit of a lessening of the fight out of the Fedayeen and the Al-Quds, possibly because they have been killing so many of them and their numbers are dwindling. Also, they believe they have them relatively isolated, relatively cut off from their lines of communication. Also, you know, they tell us that this thing could have been handled a little bit more swiftly, but one of the priorities is still not killing innocent civilians, and they also want to minimize casualties, or I'm sorry, minimize impact to the infrastructure. They don't want to damage anything if it can be avoided. Now, they are anxious to get this behind them because once these attacks, which they're still characterizing as nuisance attacks, harassment attacks, are wrapped up, then they can focus on the big fight ahead. That's in Baghdad. Greta?
Greg, I know that you yourself are a veteran of the military, looking at it a little differently now as a journalist embedded. What's the level of morale among the people that you're traveling with?
It's pretty strong. It's still very, very strong, and a lot of these guys have come under fire. We've seen that fire, and a lot of them like the way they reacted. You know, you can train and train and train and never get to do it for real. Well, these guys are getting to do it for real, and they like the way they're coming through. They like the training that they've had. They feel like they are carrying this war out professionally, and that's been a motivator for them. And they're also, but they are anxious to get this thing underway, get the fight up to Baghdad. Can't say when that's coming, but probably in the days ahead, we can reasonably expect. There are some harsh conditions. At night, it's very cold. During the day, it can be hot, dusty. So they're putting up with some tough conditions, but they seem to be doing pretty well in these circumstances. Greta?
Greg, it's been more than a week since this military action started. What's the fatigue level?
Well, there's a lot of fatigue. I mean, getting sleep is a challenge, but there's operations tempo. Sometimes there's intense activity for 48 or 72 hours. Then the next 24 hours or 36 hours might not be as intense, and it's during that time where you can grab some sleep. And we have seen finally some of the commanders that we've been worried about because they've been working so hard and fighting so hard and going without sleep for so long. Some of them have finally been able to get a reasonable amount of sleep, and based on everything we're hearing, they're going to need it.
Greg, do you get information about what's going on, for instance, in the northern part of the country and different parts of the military? Are you getting lots of information so you can at least coordinate and at least have some idea of what's facing you ahead?
Well, they know what's facing them ahead, but in terms of news, no, there isn't a lot of news. You know, connectivity is difficult to maintain, certainly for these unit commanders. We try to funnel them information when we hear it from our producers in New York, or if we can get a connection to the internet. But they are kind of starved for information from the outside world. They have enough tactical information about their immediate tactical situation, but as far as strategic information, they could use more of it probably. Greta?
All right, Greg, thank you. Greg Kelly calling in. Thank you, Greg. Greg Palgat is standing by in Amman. Greg?
Hey, Greta, we've been monitoring the live shots of Baghdad tonight, and it has been probably the heaviest night of bombing the Iraqi capital has seen yet. One of the principal targets hit tonight, the telecommunications center that's right on the Tigris River. That went up in flames, and that has apparently disrupted phone service and communications throughout the country. This is just across from the information ministry where Fox and other television news agencies had been based. Reporters who were there said that the blast was quite deafening. Also hit tonight the presidential complex along the Tigris River. Again, the Republican Guard has a major barracks there, and that was hit, as well as a military industrial complex to the south of Baghdad. So a lot of targets all around the city tonight hit very, very hard. Now, Iraq's defense minister today had a few words to say. He said first that his troops are well dug in for any potential Battle of Baghdad heading our way. He said he expects Allied forces to be encircling Baghdad within the next 5 to 10 days, but that's no problem for him, because then he expects those soldiers to come into the city and to see street-to-street, house-to-house fighting, and he says that could last, in his estimation, 2 months or more. He also said that that would represent a graveyard for Allied forces. And finally, there's some new efforts to target Iraqi armor and artillery pieces a bit better than has been done before. Coalition forces have come up with a new approach they call the kill box. That is a system in which the battlefield is divided up into 35-mile square grids. The Allied pilots swoop in on the enemy targets, they avoid friendly fire, they do the damage, and then they get out out of harm's way. That's our view now from Amman, Jordan. Back to you, Greta.
Greg, King Abdullah of Jordan has a little bit of a problem. 88% of the population does not want this war in Iraq. And in terms of, are any military actions, coalition actions being launched from Jordan in light of that problem?
They make the point, Greta, that absolutely nothing is happening from here. That's the public line. The private line, the background line, is that there is a lot of activity. There is U.S. military at a base not far from the border between Jordan and Iraq. We have heard of special force activity coming from Jordan into Iraq, especially to help secure those air bases that we've been telling you about in the past week or so. They're dubbed H2 and H3. These are very important areas that could be used in any future Battle of Baghdad, also to safeguard against any Scud attacks from Iraq back over into Israel. But again, the public line is that there is no formal participation in this activity. You're right, the sentiment on the street very much against this war. In the past 4 or 5 days, we've seen the Arab Street up here rising up, a lot of violent demonstrations, but the government is trying to tamp that down, Greta.
All right, Greg, thank you. Greg Palcott, live in Amman, Jordan. Tonight, our troops are continuing their march to Baghdad, and the Republican Guard, it's waiting. Are we ready? Join us in Washington, retired Air Force Major General Burton Moore, retired Army Lieutenant Colonel Bob McGinnis, retired Marine Lieutenant Colonel Bill Cowan. General, to you, you're on the screen, writer. The defense minister says that the Iraqis are well dug in and ready for the American military. Go to the screenwriter and show us, exactly where we stand at this point.
Okay, if we pull up the screenwriter and we'll take a quick look here. And I think one thing's important, and we haven't really talked about this a lot, and I want to say never say never. There are no absolutes here, but generally, if you draw a ring around Basra, Nasiriyah, and up here at Najaf, other than that, U.S. forces generally own all of that territory. Kurdish and U.S. forces occupy most of that territory, give or take a little bit here and there. So we've got probably 40–50% of Iraq is ours. If we clear that off, we do know we've got our forces now sitting ready to go just outside of Baghdad at these two locations here against the Republican Guard force that's there. And as we've been discussing, this battle is about to be joined. We also have our elements of the 173rd up in the north, and now we know that the 101st has started to move, with some elements going, what I believe, towards Basra, and others moving up to backfill and fall in behind the 3rd Mechanized Infantry Division.
Colonel Cowan, Brett Baer reports tonight that the United States coalition, I should say, has dropped a bunker buster 5,000-pound bomb in Baghdad. What is that? I mean, I know that there's the big one, the 21,000-pound one that was tested recently in Florida. But what about this 5,000-pound one?
You asked what it is, Greta, and I'd say it's something we should have done a long time ago. This is definitely an attention getter. I'm not certain what the target was. Sounds like it might have been a telecommunications facility, and it may have been
part
something
of the presidential palace, perhaps.
Part of the palace, and probably something that was going to go pretty deep. Maybe we're trying to get some of these penetration bombs in now with these bigger weapons, to drop them in deeper and get down to some of those lower levels inside the palace or inside some of this.
makes this bomb so particularly good? I mean, I know the 21,000, I mean, I can sort of get the drift. 21,000 is pretty big. But
delayed detonation is one thing. You want to let that bomb get way down inside that structure before it actually goes off. And so you have to have a lot of special fusing, special materials, a special timing of that thing. So normally when a round impacts, as soon as it hits, it explodes. In this case, this thing hits and continues on through and then explodes down deep. So you get tremendous shock effect, tremendous blast effect inside. Blow a lot of stuff up and out.
Colonel McInnes, we didn't get Saddam last Wednesday night when we first started. He's buried deep in his bunker, and Colonel Collins just told us about the 5,000 pound. You know something about this bunker system that he has, Saddam. Why is he so protected? What's so great about it?
Well, in one bunker, he spent $150 million about a decade ago with a German company to fortify it with all the luxuries of life above ground and about a foot or so of steel and a lot of concrete. So
can it withstand a 5,000 pound bunker buster?
If it's, I would believe that it can, and that's on the unfortunate reality. Keep in mind, he has 30 that he built during the Iran-Iraq War, and we bombed one of those back in '91, and unfortunately we killed 400 people because he had on the second floor below a command and control center. So, you know, that's the nature of the animal we're dealing with. We have to have good intelligence. We have to know where he is. He constantly moves around. He has some very sophisticated bunkers, and these bunkers are under mosque. They're, you know, virtually anywhere you can imagine. He digs like a gopher. He has special equipment. He's been using it for decades, and it's very difficult to get to him.
General, you're a retired Air Force. We own the skies over Baghdad, actually over the entire country. Where is the Iraqi military? Why haven't we heard anything about them? Why haven't, I mean, not the military, but the Air Force?
Well, I think the short answer to that, Greta, is the Air Force is taking a pass. They're going to sit out this war. And I say that for a couple of reasons. One, as they found out in the first Gulf War, if they flew, they died. It was as simple as that. The overwhelming superiority of both our equipment, our technology, and our pilots totally decimated their Air Force. The second thing, if you notice, we have not been hitting up until just recently any airfields or any aircraft on the ground at all. You know, we know that they're there. We know where they are. We've got intelligence pictures, which tells me that we have received some signals, either intelligence or otherwise, that the Air Force commanders have already decided that they'd rather be part of the regime after Saddam than to be part of this regime and die.
All right, gentlemen, stand by for a moment. Bombs are dropping, and we're going to take you to the war zone in just a moment. But first, Jane Skinner has the latest. Jane?
Thanks very much. Here is the latest. Powerful explosions continue to rock Baghdad. As Greta was mentioning, the Pentagon is confirming tonight it did drop for the first time in this operation a 5,000-pound bomb known as the Bunker Buster. Military officials are telling us that coalition forces also fired several carbon filament cruise missiles. They were aimed at electrical and telecommunications targets. Well, Fox News has also learned that U.S. intelligence says it is almost positive that Saddam Hussein is alive, in control, and preparing for the battle over Baghdad. As for that body that was taken away on a gurney the first night of the bombings, Washington believes it may have been Saddam's son, Qusay. In northern Iraq, Army paratroopers are digging out equipment that was dropped in muddy fields for them. They waited in foxholes around an Iraqi airstrip as cargo planes flew in the supplies. The 173rd Airborne parachuted in to set up and secure a northern front. In the meantime, coalition forces still own the skies, as we've been talking about tonight. Check out these numbers. In the past 24 hours, the Navy says 180 sorties have been flown from carriers in the region. More than 1,500 have been flown to date from the Navy. 830 of them were strikes on predetermined targets. And coalition forces launched Tomahawk cruise missiles from the USS Winston Churchill in the eastern Mediterranean. 675 cruise missiles have been fired since the beginning of the air campaign. CENTCOM is confirming that a Predator drone, one of those unmanned spy planes, has been shot down over Iraq. It could be the one that they've been showing on Al Jazeera TV. That TV network also is claiming that the Iraqis shot down another American Apache helicopter today. However, the U.S. military says that's just the same chopper that was shot down on Monday that they're showing. Now, time to send you back to Greta.
Wendell Golders at the White House. Wendell?
Greta, President Bush and Prime Minister Tony Blair held their second summit in as many weeks at the presidential retreat in Camp David in the Maryland mountains today. They looked at how the overall battle plan for Iraq is working, took a look at rebuilding the country after the war, and at getting humanitarian aid to the Iraqi people now. And if there was any obvious progress from the summit, it was on the latter, with an aid deal likely to be announced at the UN Security Council as early as tomorrow. Prime Minister Blair stopped off in New York on his way back to London for talks with Secretary General Kofi Annan, just as the Security Council reached broad agreement about having the UN run Iraq's Oil for Food program. The program fed two-thirds of the country before it was suspended shortly before the war began. That left Iraqi civilians desperate for U.S. and British aid deliveries, which were delayed by the fighting and by mines Iraq had placed in a major harbor. Russia and Syria had argued that giving the UN control of the Oil for Food program would infringe on the rights of Saddam Hussein's government, but Blair said at a news conference at Camp David the problem is too urgent to wait for Hussein's inevitable demise.
There's no doubt at all that the United Nations has got to be closely involved in this process. That's not just right, it's in everyone's interest that it happens. All I'm saying to people is the focus, the immediate focus, has got to be on the Oil for Food program, because that is the thing we need to get sorted out with the United Nations literally in the next few days.
Blair and the president both rejected analysts' claims that the war is going slower than expected. They spotlighted the coalition's military achievements, seizing Iraq's southern oil fields and securing the area from which Iraq launched Scud missiles into Israel a decade ago, parachuting troops into northern Iraq and marching hundreds of miles toward Baghdad from the south. President Bush shrugged off predictions that the war could go on for months.
However long it takes. That's the answer to your question, and that's what you got to know. If I can, it's a matter of timetable, it's a matter of victory. And the Iraqi people have got to know that, see? They got to know that they will be liberated and Saddam Hussein will be removed no matter how long it takes.
The president wraps up his most visible week in more than a month tomorrow with a speech to major veterans organizations in the Rose Garden. Then it's back to Camp David, where he spent Wednesday night, this time a much more relaxing weekend with the First Lady. Greta?
Wendell, thank you. Jonathan Hunt is in Kuwait City. Jonathan?
Greta, the sandstorms have lifted and the tempo of battle has been lifted too. The fighting more fierce than it has been for days. Troops from the 3rd Infantry Division engaged Iraqi forces near Najaf almost as soon as the sandstorm there dissipated, killing dozens of Iraqi soldiers, moving forward to what's expected to be an intense battle around the Shiite city of Karbala, where we understand Republican Guard units are lying in wait. Further south, battles continuing around Nasiriyah. Iraqi positions coming under heavy shelling from coalition artillery. Hundreds of Iraqi soldiers killed and captured, and we understand some coalition troops have been injured in that fighting. Thousands of civilians are also leaving Nasiriyah, having been warned by coalition troops that it is not safe to stay. Many of them expected to head south, where British troops are already handing out aid. Hundreds of Iraqis, in fact, mobbed soldiers today as they distributed food and water supplies near Basra. Boxes containing flour, bread, water and tea. Much more aid is at hand, including medicine and clothing. A lot of it based on ships which are off right now. The port city of Qasr. That is set to become the main base for distribution of aid. The arrival of the first ships, though, has been put back because of the discovery of more mines in the water approaches to the port. Meantime, in the Rumaila oil field, wells continue to burn. Firefighters there say they could have them all extinguished within a matter of days, but that won't be the end of the problem. There are approximately 800 wellheads in the oil fields of southern Iraq, and coalition forces have to comb all of those for explosives before the taps can be reopened. And Greta, another threat became apparent in the waters off southern Iraq today. An Iranian gunboat intercepted an Iraqi speedboat filled with explosives, which rather confirms the threat that the Navy has been worried about to all coalition vessels in those waters. It also means that the port of Qasr clearly is not safe yet, but coalition forces, an array of them, are now keeping a very close eye on all activity in those waterways. That's the latest live from Kuwait City. Greta?
Jonathan, in terms of the oil wells, I realize that they're all under control now and you have to look for explosives, but are all the oil fields seized by coalition forces so that we needn't worry that more will be set on fire?
Yeah, they do have control of all the oil fields across southern Iraq. There is still some question of control of the oil fields in the north, but those paratroopers who landed in northern Iraq last night will move to get control of the oil fields there. The problem is, though, Greta, that these fires can still come up because of the explosives. And as the troops move in to explore all of these oil fields, they could trigger some of the booby traps. That could set new blazes going. Greta.
All right, Jonathan, thank you. Coming up at the top of the hour, my colleague Linda Vester takes over our continuing live coverage of the war. Let's check in with her now. Linda?
Greta, thank you. We have a lot to get to at the top of the hour, including Jesse Jackson, just out of a meeting with UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, calling for an end to the war in Iraq. We're going to ask him why he is so dead set against the progress of Operation Iraqi Freedom. At the same time, Iraqi opposition leaders tonight are calling for Iraqis back in their home country to rise up in revolt against Saddam. Our State Department is warning them, hey, not so fast. We're going to talk with a senior member of the Iraqi National Congress about this. And for those who are wondering if Kofi Annan, the Russians, and the French are gaming the U.S. and the U.K. at the United Nations, we'll ask a senior diplomat. All that, plus some fresh live reports from our correspondents in the region and expert military analysis. It's all at the top of the hour on a special live edition of Operation Iraqi Freedom, late night on the East Coast, prime time in the West. Greta?
And of course, live, you take everything as it happens, and you follow everything in the war in Iraq as it does happen. Linda, thank you.
All right.
Is it too soon to worry about surrender, and could a misstep in the surrender process give us a bigger problem than we have now? Joining us from Miami is former Senate Majority Leader George Mitchell, who brokered peace in Northern Ireland in 1998. Welcome back, Senator.
Thanks, Greta.
Senator, should we be thinking about the surrender process now? I realize we haven't had our fiercest battles yet, but should that be something that we need to focus attention on?
Well, obviously, the administration and the military leaders are thinking about that, but I think that the first and highest priority is to complete the military action that's now underway, hopefully bring it to a swift and successful conclusion.
Senator, though, at the point that it does end, and if it's possible we could have a quick, fast surrender, we don't yet have a provisional government. And so, I mean, at least the Bush administration has not fully revealed the blueprint for it. What do you recommend?
Well, that's going to be very difficult because we have two objectives and they are directly in conflict. The first is that we not engage in a long-term American military occupation of Iraq. I think a long-term military occupation by the United States of an Arab Muslim country in the Middle East would be a very, very bad thing for our long-term interests. On the other hand, we can't just pull out and let chaos develop. So I hope and I presume that the administration has extensive planning in that regard and is going to try to reconcile those two objectives and find the right balance. But Greta, I have to say that there's nothing that indicates that there's going to be a quick surrender. This thing could, of course, turn around quite suddenly, but I think the most important task is to complete the immediate military task that is before us, and that is to bring about the change in regime that is now the objective of U.S. and British and other coalition partners' policy.
That raised a question in my mind that, I mean, I assume that at the point that Saddam either surrenders or is killed, that that's the regime change. What do we do with him if we take him alive?
I don't think that's likely to occur, but the president has already said that he and a fairly substantial number of his closest supporters, probably a larger list now in view of what's going on in the country, will be tried as war criminals. So there'll have to be some process established for dealing with that, but I don't think that's likely to occur.
What's your thought about the reaction so far in the area? I mean, you still have all the Jordanians, they're opposed to it. Syria's now helping out Iraq by selling night goggles and other military equipment. Russia's helping out. There are a lot of countries surrounding Iraq, none of whom seem very interested in supporting the coalition. What do we do about that big-term problem?
No matter what happens in Iraq, there will not be stability in the Middle East until the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is addressed under U.S. leadership and resolved. One of the real problems that we have in the region is that the overwhelming majority of people in that area, and indeed in many other parts of the world, believe that that's the real problem that we should be addressing, not Iraq. The President has said as recently as today, obviously urged by Prime Minister Blair, that we're going to deal with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and that's essential to stability in the region. I repeat, no matter what happens in Iraq, even if we were successful tomorrow morning, if Saddam Hussein just simply gave up and we're able to take over in Iraq, that's not going to produce stability in the region. It's going to have to be an addressing of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
All right, Senator, always nice to see you. Thank you for joining us. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Greta, for having me.
Fox's Rick Leventhal is traveling with the 1st Marines 3rd Light Armored Reconnaissance Battalion and joins us. Rick, what's up?
Well, Greta, the sun has risen on another day here in a very stark landscaped area. Just a lot of dirt on the horizon right now and a lot of military vehicles. Everybody's fueling up this morning and stocking up on food and water. Our particular light armored vehicle, our LAV, is completely empty now of food and water. And it was a very rough night. We had 2 gas scares during the night. We were actually sleeping outside, very cold outside, all bundled up in our sleeping bags, and then the cries of gas, gas, gas. So we had to jump up, throw on our masks, find our boots, jump back inside our vehicle. They went to level 4, which meant we had to put our gloves, our hoods, our boots on, and then sat there for 20 to 30 minutes until we got the all clear. Went back out, tried to go back to sleep, and roughly an hour or 2 later, the same thing happened again. In the meantime, we were parked next to a bank of howitzer cannons, providing some security on the flank, and they were pretty active throughout the night. Several barrages, sometimes 40 to 50 shells being fired per barrage, and it's louder than any 4th of July fireworks you ever heard. So needless to say, few of us got very much sleep, and it looks like it could be another very long day, Greta.
Rick, what actually provokes the gas scares? Are you traveling with the Fox vehicle, which detects chemicals? Or, I mean, what is it that provokes them?
There is one of those within our unit, but it's unclear what prompted both of the scares last night. There are a variety of sensors that they employ out here. They also have pigeons in cages that can be early warning signs of chemicals, or they could be just sparked by incoming mortar fire or artillery fire that they might be concerned could have chemical warheads on it. It's not clear what sparked the cries last night, but you know, with all of the talk now about chemical weapons being used by the Iraqis, people are even more on edge and take these things very seriously.
When you get, do people actually yell out gas, or is there some sort of alarm system in your convoy?
Well, that is the first warning sign. There are multiple ways that they can tell us. There are horns, signals they can use, and sirens that they will use, and hand signals when it's daytime. But the quickest, easiest way to spread word around the camp that there's a gas attack or a scare is to yell out gas, gas, gas. And when you hear it, you know it's time to start putting on your mask, and you're also supposed to yell it out to the people next to you know the same thing.
All right, you said that you're fueling up right now. What type of vehicle are you traveling in?
We're in a light armored vehicle. It's a 14-ton, 8-wheeled vehicle with tires, not tracks. It's very versatile, and it can drive in all sorts of conditions, and that's what makes up the bulk of the vehicles in the in the 3rd Light Armor Reconnaissance Battalion. They all drive these LAVs with different variations. Some of them have anti-aircraft weapons. Some have these rocket launchers and tow missile launchers, and others have the 25mm chain guns on them, which is what we have on ours. But this is a backbone of the LAR, the LAV.
So how are the guys that you're traveling with? How are they doing as you put up with this this trek to Baghdad?
They're getting a little weary, but they're still motivated. You know, yesterday we were on the highway and saw a Baghdad highway sign, and that got the guys going a bit. You know, they're pretty pumped up about that, and you know, we're certainly within striking distance, or within you know, we could be within striking distance rather quickly, and you know, I don't want to get myself in trouble here, but suffice it to say that, you know, they're motivated and anxious to finish the job.
And are you hearing about what's going on in other parts of the country? Are that information being relayed to you?
The only time I hear about that is when I call in and get information from you or from people on the desk. You know, and I try to pass that along to these guys. They're starved for information, and just anytime I have an update, you know, every Marine within earshot wants to know what it is.
Well, I'll give you one update. They're bringing in more forces to help with the coalition military action, Rick.
That's good news, Greta. The more the merrier.
I figured you'd like to hear that one. Rick, thank you very much. Tell the guys you're traveling with thank you as well. Let's bring back in retired Air Force Major General Burton Moore, retired Marine Lieutenant Colonel Bill Cowan, retired Army Lieutenant Colonel Bob McGinnis. General, you have a thought on that 5,000-pound bunker bomb, what it may have been, what the target may have been tonight. What do you think?
Well, I think it was a regime target of some kind. It could be a command bunker where we either had some intelligence or a strong suspicion that Saddam Hussein or some of his top leadership was. It would be right in line with what we're talking about, these airstrikes in Baghdad, going after key remaining leadership targets to assist when the 3rd Infantry Division meets the Republican Guard. Now, the key thing about this bunker buster bomb, we weaponeer very closely as to what that thing can do. So we wanted to either send a signal to someone in that bunker that we know where you are, or we drop that bomb to take whoever was in that bunker out. There's no question about that.
Colonel Cowan, when you sit and listen to Rick Leventhal, you've seen action, lots of action in Vietnam. What do you think when you hear him describe what's going on?
Well, I've got the enthusiasm to want to be there, Greta, but the thing that I'm interested in, Rick's talking about, is how tired these guys are. They've been on the run for a long time, on the road that is, not on the run, moving forward towards Baghdad. And it's going to be very important before we really get in there and engage the Republican Guard that these guys have a little bit of a chance to rest up. Certainly they've got to replenish and resupply. That's going to be an issue. But when you kick off that battle against the Republican Guard, you've got to make sure that your guys are alert, that your leadership is able to make good decisions, because when you're out there, you're tired, you're beat, and I have seen it, days and days of staying awake.
How do you rest under those conditions? I mean, if he gets waken up, first of all, it's cold in the middle of the night, then he gets awakened with gas scares. I mean, even if they do bring it to a grinding halt at some point before they hit Baghdad and let everyone regroup, how do you rest?
20 minutes here, Greta, 20 minutes there, you know, staying up, you're enthused, you're motivated, things are going on, but I've seen it myself. You wear down after a number of days where you get tired, and your decision-making process is not the best, and that's when you run into trouble with controlling your troops, coordinating the ground action, coordinating the airstrikes, and making sure you don't make mistakes that cost lives.
Colonel McGinnis, report tonight, according to Jane Skinner, that U.S. Military authorities think Saddam is still alive. What do you think?
I think he's alive, Greta. You know,
Why?
I think it was probably Qusay that they took out of the rubble of that building. I think Saddam is orchestrating everything. You look at what the paramilitary, the Fedayeen Saddam, the Al-Quds, even the Border Patrol and the Ba'athist Party, they're controlling all the resistance from Basra. And, you know, the people in Basra would have surrendered and probably have kicked out the military a long time ago if they'd had a gun to their head. The Nasiriyah, certainly Navja, and then now Kabbalah, we're having major resistance along that. That's part of course, the reconsolidation of our forces in preparation for future operations. We've got to do that. But he is orchestrating that. Just watch the TV over there, and you'll see.
We're not going to watch any TV right now. We took care of that one yesterday and today.
Well, the word is that he, because the French and the Germans and the Russians have a very sophisticated communication means, he has a mobile television system which he'll come up every so often and communicate to his people.
And say they're winning. I mean, that's what I think is extraordinary. Listening to the reports from some of these Iraqis is, you know, they're watching a different war than apparently we're watching.
They really are.
They got a whole different war. General, as we look at the situation tonight with the Republican Guard around Baghdad, we've got our military forces coming up from the south. We've got the paratroopers creating that northern front, minus the 62,000 that weren't staged in Turkey. Are we ready? I mean, do we have enough boots on the ground?
Well, I'm sure any commander on the ground would like to have more forces. It would have been helpful to have the 4th Infantry Division in early to give a heavy force coming down from the north. However, the Plan B has been adjusted. I think we're ready to go, and I think as we continue to attrit these Republican Guard forces, the 3rd, the 1st Marines, and the 1st UK, as well as the 101st, 173rd, they won't engage until it's on their timeline. As Bill and Bob have said, they want the troops rested, they need fuel, they need ammo, they need to make sure their battle plan is good to go. So when the time comes, they will be ready to engage, I assure you.
And, you know, what's interesting is that you listen to these reports of the field, you know, the men out there, they're working the hardest under the most, the toughest conditions, sandstorms, morale, but they seem so determined.
Listen to those young troops this morning that had been wounded, Greta. They had that press conference out of Germany. That was just amazing to listen to these guys talk.
And with a little humor, too, some of them.
A little bit of humor, good attitude.
But they wanted to get back and fight with their, protect their
Exactly.
troops.
You can see that bonding they had with their troops.
Amazing, amazing, the military, and with the journalists embedded, we sure get a great look at them. They're amazing. Gentlemen, as always, thank you very much for joining us, and a special thanks to our coalition troops in the battlefield and their families all over the world for making such a great sacrifice. And keep your TV locked on Fox News Channel for late-breaking updates on Operation Iraqi Freedom. I'll see you right back here tomorrow night, but don't go away. We continue our live coverage of this war, and Linda Vester, she's next. She's here.
You are looking live at Baghdad, 7 a.m. now in the Iraqi capital, newly hit with some of the strongest explosions felt there in days. This now includes a 5,000-pound bunker buster bomb. At least a dozen big blasts hammering the city around 11 p.m. Baghdad time. Among the apparent targets, one of Saddam's presidential compounds. You are looking live at the Pentagon. Senior defense officials saying 90,000 coalition forces now inside Iraq and on the move. Some staggering numbers to report to you. 14,000 new troops have pushed in there just since last night. This including the 173rd Airborne Brigade, now on the ground in Kurdish-controlled northern Iraq. President Bush wrapping up his war council with British Prime Minister Tony Blair, our commander-in-chief saying we will be in Iraq for as long as it takes, and both leaders agreeing on the outcome. The Iraqi people will be free, whatever it takes. Live reports from our correspondents in the field, in-depth military analysis, and the Reverend Jesse Jackson on a special edition of Fox News right now. is 8 p.m. on the West Coast, 11 p.m. on the East Coast. Hi, everyone. I'm Linda Vester in New York. A huge influx of coalition forces inside Iraq in the last 24 hours. We have Fox News live team coverage of America at War with Jonathan Hunt live in Kuwait City, Wendell Goler live at the White House. But first, national security correspondent Brett Baer. He is live at the Pentagon. Brett.
Hi, Linda. Tonight, news strikes inside Baghdad. The rolling air campaign continues to take out key Iraqi regime targets. Reportedly, one of Saddam's many presidential compounds hit tonight. The air campaign really starting about a few hours ago with some major explosions. The Iraqi ministries of information, planning, and foreign affairs all reportedly hit. There was one massive plume of smoke that you see here after a strike. That was said to be the presidential compound, and that huge plume was the result of a bunker buster bomb. Defense officials now tell Fox for the first time in this operation, a 5,000-pound bunker buster, a GBU-37, was dropped from a B-2 stealth bomber. Now, Pentagon officials also say B-52 bombers, the workhorse bombers of the Air Force, now able to operate directly over the city of Baghdad around the clock after Baghdad's air defenses have been significantly degraded. So far, over the past 8 days, more than 5,000 bombs and missiles have landed inside Iraq. On the ground, coalition forces near Najaf saw heavy fighting throughout the night, unconventional fighting with a mix of Iraqi Republican Guard, Ba'ath Party members, and Fedayeen Saddam, who we're told were dealt with. Other units, meantime, took advantage of the good weather today to close in on their goal.
It goes hour by hour. This is moving so quickly. When I was on just an hour ago, we were 60 miles from Baghdad. Now it's less than 50, and the fight continues. The helicopters you hear taking off behind us are armed Cobras.
Now, Pentagon officials say any Republican Guard vehicles seen moving out of Baghdad to the south are picked off from the air from coalition bombers and fighters that are essentially identifying them and taking them out. The upcoming battles with those dug-in Republican Guard divisions, though, a few rings of them around Baghdad, are now seen as the key to this war.
I think it's only reasonable to expect that it will require the coalition forces moving through some Republican Guard units and destroying them or capturing them before you'll see the crumbling of the regime.
And some crumbling taking place outside Basra today. You can see this is a British vehicle taking down that sign. Pentagon officials say until the...
CNN's continuing coverage of the war in Iraq with Aaron Brown right now.
Good evening again, everyone. 6 in the morning in Baghdad. A night where there were huge explosions in the city. And again, we believe, daylight will allow us to confirm that perhaps it was the information ministry that was hit. What we saw, and what we'll show you in a little bit, was an enormous explosion, particularly close to the camera locations that we have. That's the scene in Baghdad at 6 o'clock now on a Saturday morning. Good evening again, everyone. We begin, as we do every night here, with the big picture. And tonight, the big picture includes American forces digging in just short of Baghdad, racing supplies to catch up. It includes the 101st Airborne seeing its first action. We saw today an apparent Iraqi missile strike hit Kuwait. They had tried 13 times, and on the 13th time, apparently they were successful. The coalition airstrikes go on around the clock. And today, again, Iraqi civilian casualties were shown to the world. Neighboring countries were accused of meddling by the Secretary of Defense. And all along the region, there were more indications that this war is neither easy nor simple. As one Marine put it today, it's not that easy to conquer a country, is it? On day 9 of the war, there was combat across the breadth of the theater, as convoys and supply lines continued to stretch for hundreds of miles. About 40% of the country, according to the Pentagon, is now under coalition control. But the Secretary of Defense said another country, Syria, was shipping critical equipment, night vision goggles, across the border to the Iraqis.
We consider such trafficking as hostile acts and will hold the Syrian government accountable for such shipments.
The Syrians vigorously deny it. Inside Iraq, American units surrounding Baghdad seem to be settling in, setting the force in the military's term. The Army's 3rd Infantry and the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force are positioned near Karbala, 50 miles south of the Iraqi capital. The 101st Airborne is to the west of that, and nearly 200 American helicopters are bringing in scores of foot soldiers as reinforcements for what's expected to be a huge and critical battle with Iraq's Republican Guard.
This is a airfield that has only been taken over for a few days, but already it is quickly sprouting into what is going to become a major operation.
To help mitigate thinly stretched supply lines, the Air Force has taken control of airfields deep inside of Iraq, bases from where resupply will be easier. In the air, American units work day and night, as CNN's Ryan Chilcote reported.
The 101st Airborne just executed its first deep attack. It used its Apache attack helicopters, specifically the Apache Longbow helicopters, sent dozens of these helicopters southwest of Baghdad.
Some Iraqis are welcoming the Americans, but the assaults against American and British troops by Iraqi guerrilla forces continue unabated. CNN's Alessio Vinci is near the embattled city of Nasiriyah, where the price of war is starkly clear.
Hostilities in Nasiriyah prevented the Marines from recovering the bodies of their fallen comrades earlier.
And Alex Perry of Time magazine talked to a local commander near Nasiriyah who summed up the new American attitude.
One commander addressing his men yesterday, his instructions to his men were, if you see an Iraqi civilian coming towards you, even if he's just waving a stick, shoot it.
Death was present in Baghdad as well. Al Jazeera television broadcast the aftermath of what the Iraqi government claims was an American air attack on a residential neighborhood. More than 50 civilians, according to Baghdad, were killed. Overnight, the explosions continued. Meantime, far to the south in Basra, there were reports from the British that Iraqi Fedayeen had fired mortar rounds on refugees trying to flee the city. And protected by commandos, the supply ship Galahad finally docked in the port of Qasr, bringing badly needed stockpiles of food and water intended for the civilian population. And in Kuwait City, a missile that went undetected by the country's air defense system exploded near one of the city's upscale shopping malls. Only one injury, no one badly hurt, some physical damage though, but more damage perhaps to the Kuwaiti state of mind. So that's the big picture. Those are the major stories we'll be covering over the next 4 hours and everything else that happens in front of us. The task here is to take these small pieces and to put them into the large picture. In the south of Iraq, which was supposed to fall quickly into coalition hands, there is still considerable fighting going on as British Marines on patrol outside the city of Basra discovered today. Here is 40 seconds of their very long day.
Incoming! Hear it! What's out of the way, son? 100 rupees. Right, boys! Keep digging! Helmets, body armor on! We're too far!
The Battle of Basra inside the city. Anarchy now seems to be setting in of a sort. There is looting reported, starvation, roving gangs of Iraqi government thugs terrorizing civilians as they try to get out or simply get out of the way. Juliette Bremer, the British pool correspondent there, and she's filed for us tonight.
Too scared to stay. Families from Basra braved the crossing out of the city despite the fact it had been hit by mortars just hours earlier. Shortly after dawn, a group of around 300 refugees emerged from behind the burning oil holes that marked the boundary of Basra towards this British-held bridge. Officers watched in horror as a barrage of mortars exploded around them, almost certainly launched from paramilitaries who still control the port.
My troops were deployed forward, as they have been for some time, again checking and screening the transit of people through, and when they came under indirect fire from what we assessed to have been mortar fire. Clearly there were civilians in the area too, and they dispersed very quickly. The rounds were landing relatively close to where they were.
This time, no one was killed, but security checks on all those leaving or entering have moved on to an even higher level. The attack on the convoy of refugees this morning only serves to underline the worst fears of British troops, that people are being held against their will in Basra, and that the paramilitaries will use the most violent means possible to prevent them leaving. Despite the British conviction that the refugees were deliberately targeted, it is possible that they were simply caught up in an attack on the front line. But the teams securing the bridge have no doubt that irregular fighters are trying to slip in and out of Basra. Suspects are rounded up and escorted back to their base for interrogation. The overall commander of the Desert Rats accused the paramilitaries of appalling brutality.
We've been hearing stories of this kind of brutality, but this is the first occasion on which we've actually witnessed it.
So why wasn't he intervening to end the suffering?
Well, I'm weighing up the risk to my own forces. I'm weighing up the risk to the civilians who are being held hostage, effectively, in Basra.
For those risking this dangerous journey, the delay could be deadly. A bleak choice between running out of food or braving the crossfire. Juliet Bremner, near Basra.
British Pool report out of Basra today. One of the dominant storylines of the day has been the image of civilian casualties. They were broadcast around the world, including here in the United States. Especially gruesome pictures were seen across Arab media. They came out of a marketplace in a Baghdad neighborhood. The Iraqi position is, according to the information minister, that dozens of people died in a coalition airstrike on that neighborhood. The Central Command, the coalition side, says they believe for now the damage may have been caused by an Iraqi aircraft fire that had somehow gone astray. This is what happens in war, the two sides trying to argue their case in the international media. CNN's Nick Robertson has been following this part of the story as it unfolds tonight. He's at the Iraqi-Jordanian border again. And Nick, as always, good evening to you.
Good evening, Aaron, and very, very difficult even for the journalists inside Baghdad to try and verify those figures and accounts of what happened in the early evening hours last night, Baghdad time. And for us here, the CNN team stuck outside of Iraq, doubly difficult. But talking to reporters inside Baghdad, they told me they were called by Iraq's Minister of Information shortly after dusk and told to go to this residential neighborhood just west of the center of the city to investigate what the Iraqi officials told them was a coalition bomb. And certainly the images from this evening will further polarize positions on this war. A brilliant flash illuminates the area around the information ministry in Baghdad as what appears to be government buildings in the center of the city are targeted. Only a few hours earlier, crowds gathered around a crater in a suburban neighborhood. Impossible to see how deep it is or what caused it. According to Iraqi officials who rushed journalists to the site just after dusk, the damage caused by a coalition bomb. In a nearby hospital, the injured were still being brought in, many clearly in pain.
Around 6 p.m., an enemy aircraft attacked the neighborhood while we were in the hospital, assisting the wounded from this morning attack. The scoured aircraft attacked a popular market filled with residents.
According to the hospital staff, at least 51 people were killed and more than 50 injured. From these pictures alone, it is impossible to verify the number of casualties. Several children, however, seem to be victims. Within hours of the blast, Iraq's information minister lambasted coalition forces,
My explanation is that this is a heavy aggression on civilians to cover up for a series of defeat that our army caused them in the desert in different neighborhoods in Baghdad.
Coalition forces said they could not confirm an attack in this neighborhood. In a war whose images seem increasingly split between civilian casualties and frontline conflict, this latest incident looks set to widen the divide. Indeed, as you say, Aaron, the Arab media, particularly in this region around Iraq, are playing much stronger images than the images we have used. I saw on one station pictures in the mortuary, apparently at the same hospital, of some children, perhaps 5 or 6 years old. The images being seen in this region, very, very emotive indeed. Aaron?
It seems to me that we ought to try and make a couple of points here. Number one, while certainly the Iraqis are using this moment to their best advantage, we ought never forget that these are real people who were, however it happened, clearly wounded. Some died, and that's a horrible thing. The second is that the British side, the American side, also used the Basra situation to try and make their international argument that the Iraqi government is barbaric by using the shooting of the civilians. And what you end up having in the region is a war of words. Who wins the war of images? Do the Americans ever win that battle?
Certainly the Iraqi authorities know that this is perhaps one of the strongest elements they have in their arsenal against the United States, against Great Britain, because it is so emotive. The injuries to civilians who, as you rightly say, are very real people. I think perhaps everyone knows that war is a very dirty and ugly business, but perhaps this war, because of the level of coverage that it has had from both sides, is perhaps exposing to an audience that has never really seen it before just how bad and ugly it is. And it happens in a very short time frame. And both sides, because of the necessities of war, both sides in this need to win the war. Both sides have a necessity to present in the best light their particular case. And certainly for the Iraqis, it is highlighting civilian casualties. For coalition forces, it is to show that they are being compassionate towards Iraqi civilians, which is absolutely their intended, stated purpose here. That is to remove the regime, but not in any way to harm the population, Aaron.
And just one more point. It seems like now 3 days in a row, they have tried to take out the Iraqis' ability to communicate. There was the hit on state-run TV, and there seemed to be, over the last 2 nights, attacks around the information ministry. So far, unsuccessful, correct?
So far, Iraq's state-run television is still on the air. However, the channel that is run by President Saddam Hussein's elder son, Uday Saddam Hussein, we understand that is off the air. Iraq's third station, if you will, its satellite broadcast network, that appears to be off the air. The communications tower that was in the center of Baghdad, a communications building that was hit on the previous night, that apparently has affected some telephone services within the city. So there does appear to be some degradation of Iraqi officialdom's ability to reach and communicate with their population. It is not entirely severed, and at this stage we still don't know what's happened fully to Iraq's information ministry. But it appears that much of the superstructure of the building is still in place, because that's where those cameras stand that took the pictures we saw this evening.
Right. Nick, thank you. As always, Nick Robertson, who's still on the border of Iraq and Jordan, having been expelled by the Iraqi government now several days ago, and we'll talk to you later. I want to bring General Clark in a moment to talk about this, but let me put one more piece on the table here, and that's this one. The residents in Kuwait got a reminder tonight as well that they are not yet safe from the Iraqi military machine, if you will. There was a huge explosion at a shopping mall there, the result of what Kuwaiti authorities now believe was a missile attack. There's considerable evidence of that, including physical evidence in the hands of CNN's Sanjay Gupta, who was on the scene shortly after the explosion and joins us now from a safer place, if you will, our workspace there. The last time you and I talked, you literally had in your hand a piece of what almost certainly was the missile.
That's right, and I brought those pieces over as well, and I'll hold them up again while I'm talking about them. First of all, let me just say that we were told that these pieces were safe to pick up. Before we picked them up, they were actually checked out. A greenish piece here in my left hand, and a component, as you can see, both pieces there, probably pieces of the missile. One of them may be more of a sort of working component part of the missile. And this greenish sort of part is sort of a little interesting for me personally, Aaron, because I saw something fly over my head a week ago when I was at Camp Iwo Jima that looked like a green missile, got in underneath the radar. There were no alarms or anything before that thing went right over our heads. This was sort of frighteningly reminiscent of that. There were no sirens or anything this time either. The first indication we got of anything going on shortly before 2 o'clock in the morning was a loud boom, literally shaking our hotel, which is a good 10 minutes away from the Sukshuk Mall, which we've been hearing so much about. Aaron?
The earlier tonight, one of the pieces that you held up had some Chinese characters on it, which suggests very strongly the kind of, there we go, the kind of missile it was. And I know you're becoming very expert very quickly on these missiles. And perhaps the reason they avoided detection is that they come in so low.
And that's exactly what we talked to some of the Kuwaiti officials about that very point. And in fact, they took that piece that people just saw with the Chinese writing on it for investigative purposes. We were glad to let them have it. But that's exactly what they said as well. These things may be quite literally flying in under the radar, as the one did a week ago, and maybe this one as well. Again, the first indication of the actual explosion itself.
A couple more who, what, wheres here. No serious injuries, correct?
No serious injuries. One minor injury, probably from debris falling on somebody's head.
And I suspect that we said, in fact, at the top of the program, the biggest casualty may be the Kuwaiti state of mind. After a week and a half of this, they had come to believe perhaps that the Patriots would protect them from anything like this, and that turns out not to be so.
Yeah, you know, it's really interesting. A couple of things struck me. First of all, I guess in any sort of situation like this, it was kind of, there was pandemonium there. A lot of people really struggling to try and get close to it, and then the authorities quickly coming in and creating barriers around the explosion site. But they moved with a lot of efficiency, the authorities, that is, almost as if, A, they had been through this before, which they had, and B, almost as if they were expecting something like this. First the civilian authorities, followed by the military authorities. There were chemical and biological checks going on all the time. There was a lot of concern initially, but as people started to get the sense, A, that no one was hurt, and B, that there was no chemical or biological weapons being detected by these sensors, you could almost see this sense of relief coming over people despite this just horrible thing that had just happened. Again, no one being hurt, this happening at 2 o'clock in the morning, no one being in the mall, were all sort of the good things out of this very bad thing. Aaron?
Sanjay, thank you. Dr. Sanjay Gupta in Kuwait. And now we've put a number of pieces on the table. Let's turn to General Wes Clark, who's back with us in Atlanta. Back to front here. The significance that a week and a half into this, the Iraqis still have the capability to hit Kuwait City.
Well, we haven't put enough forces to clear the zone in all of southern Iraq. We're still working around Basra. This missile was a silkworm. It was somewhere around Qusayr, Basra, somewhere like that, from which it was launched. Not surprising. Until we fully clear that zone, there's the chance they could hit us again.
Let's say there's also, would it not then stand to reason there's a chance they could just change direction and aim it at a concentration of coalition forces?
They could. There's no doubt they could do that.
So it's not simply a question they can hit Kuwait, it's that they still have the capability, a military capability in an area that at this point there was a presumption would be cleared.
It's true, but this silkworm strike on Kuwait City is essentially a terror weapon. This weapon launched inland is, we don't believe, accurate enough to hit any precision target if they had targeting capability. They fired this to send a message to the Kuwaitis.
They throw it up in the air and it comes down.
Exactly.
Well, we'll see what sort of message they sent. Now, on the subject we're talking with Nick about, this question of the image war, the political media war that's going on, each side laid out, in a sense, its best argument today. The American argument, the British argument that the Iraqis will murder their own people, they'll use them as human shields, crossing the bridge in Basra, shooting them down. the Iraqis talking about civilian casualties in the market. Do the Americans in the international, you've been through this, in the international community ever get the benefit of the doubt?
Well, we did in the Kosovo campaign, Aaron. You may remember in that campaign that there were the scenes of the collateral damage and people were injured and occasionally in these bomb attacks. But the scene of Milosevic forcefully expelling tens of thousands of Albanians from their own country turned world opinion so decisively against him that he couldn't recover. There's a fundamental asymmetry here between what's happening to the Iraqis as a result of the American bombing and what's happening to the Iraqi population as a result of the Fedayeen. The American bombing, this may have been an American bomb. We don't know right now. It hasn't been confirmed. If so, it was totally unintentional. We've done our best, the United States has done its best, I should say, to avoid striking civilian targets and hurting civilians. That's not the case with the Fedayeen, who must intentionally go after their own people because they have to. Their defense is the civilian population.
There are, in fact, a lot of people in lots of parts of the world, the Arab part of the world certainly, but in a lot of parts of the world that actually don't believe that. They will believe that Americans targeted civilians.
I'm not sure about that.
I get mail from them.
Well,
I'll show it to you.
When we work our way through, starting with the countries that have doubts about us in Europe, and we work from Europe outwards, you're going to find that they know from experience that the American bombing in Serbia was extraordinarily precise. It was extraordinarily limited, just as it has been in Baghdad to strike military targets. And occasionally something goes wrong. And it's a terrible human tragedy for the families of the innocent people and for those victims. But it's not intentional. Whereas what the Iraqis must do is use the civilian population. And what's more likely to happen is that people in the Arab world and elsewhere are going to say, well, the Iraqis have no choice, they're up against a superpower and they'll do anything and it's okay for them to do anything. Fine. But that's a different argument. And that's an argument that does violate the laws of war, which says that non-combatants must be protected.
Not to mention any sense of human decency,
Exactly.
I would say.
Exactly.
Welcome back to Atlanta. It's really good to have you back. We'll go to the Pentagon, check in with Jamie McIntyre. We need to take a break first. CNN's coverage of the war in Iraq after a short break continues.
Did you know that tomatoes contain a remarkable nutrient called lycopene? Emerging science suggests that lycopene is one of the ingredients in tomatoes that may help reduce the risk of heart disease. And now, lycopene is in Centrum, or if you're over 50, Centrum Silver. Lycopene. Another reason Centrum may do more for your health. New Centrum and Centrum Silver. Now more complete with lycopene.
So, you want to open a checking account?
Yes, but I don't want to pay for it.
Right. And you want online banking?
Right, if it's free.
And unlimited online bill paying?
I don't want to have to pay for that either. No.
So you want total security protection on your check card, free?
Look, I just don't think I should have to pay for any of it.
Neither do we.
Free checking plus with direct deposit from Bank of America. Higher standards.
You decided. Once again, CNN is #1 for trust and experience. Americans choose CNN as the most credible news source. CNN is the most trusted name in news.
Again, today there's a concerted effort by the Defense Department, by the Pentagon, to knock down the notion that things are bogging down in any way, that things are not going as expected. The troops are facing an enemy that is different from the one they anticipated. What is new, or at least new to us, some of those doubts were expressed openly by the man in charge of the ground war, and that does change the flavor of it all. That was the backdrop to the Pentagon briefing today. Here's our senior Pentagon correspondent, Jamie McIntyre. Jamie, it's nice to see you tonight.
Nice to see you, Aaron. The problem with trying to sort out what's going on at the Pentagon is that the Pentagon always says things are right on plan, but you never exactly know what the plan is. Defense Secretary Rumsfeld made that point today, even as he criticized some of the second guessing that's been going on over the last few days.
Pentagon briefings have become the front lines in a raging battle over how the war is perceived to be going.
with Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld criticizing what he called massive volumes of television and breathless reporting.
We have seen mood swings in the media from highs to lows to highs and back again, sometimes in a single 24-hour period.
Rumsfeld said he had only seen the headlines on Washington Post and New York Times articles reporting that the commander of U.S. ground forces, Lieutenant General William Wallace, answered it's beginning to look that way when asked if the war would be longer than expected. The enemy we're fighting is different from the one we war-gamed against, he also conceded.
F-16 delivering precision-guided munition.
The Pentagon countered with a montage of cockpit videos of successful airstrikes and maps showing that U.S. and British forces control as much as 40% of Iraqi territory and 95% of the skies.
The plan is sound, it's being executed, and it's on track, and that's essentially what General Wallace said too. He said we're about where we expected to be. That's one of his quotes as well.
After delays caused by mines in the harbor, humanitarian aid on a British ship has finally reached the port of Qasr. The Pentagon insists delays in getting food, fuel, and ammunition to U.S. troops on the front lines in Iraq were mostly due to sandstorms and dismissed any attacks on the 300-mile-long supply lines as, quote, militarily insignificant. But even as the U.S. encircles Baghdad and moves Apache helicopters in position to pound Republican Guard troops, the Pentagon admits there's a key unknown, the extent to which the Iraqi people may feel a patriotic fervor to resist U.S. forces sent to liberate them. Despite being a linchpin of U.S. policy, Rumsfeld insists the Iraqi mood is unknowable.
They might even feel a little different if the death squads are not standing next to them with guns to their heads. But why should I try to speculate as to what it will be, since we will soon know?
Death squads is what the Pentagon is calling the Fedayeen Saddam now, and the U.S. is continuing to try to target them. We're getting word tonight from the U.S. Central Command that U.S. F-15 jets attacked a two-story building in Basra, just about 300 yards away from the Al-Basra Christian Church. According to U.S. intelligence, about 200 of these Fedayeen fighters were meeting in a building there. They used a special bomb that has a delayed fuse so that it would penetrate the building, explode inside, and minimize the collateral damage. They say they don't believe they damaged the church that short distance away. Aaron?
Do they have the bomb damage assessment on this yet?
Well, they just dropped the bombs a short time ago, and of course it always takes a little time to figure out if the pilots come back. They always have very optimistic reports about hitting their targets, but they have to check the videos and see what they actually show.
So we'll see what tomorrow brings on that, Jamie. Thank you, Jamie McIntyre. Well, another long day at the Pentagon. The president is at Camp David. Before he left, he once again tried to underscore the administration's view of things. Dana Bash has the White House Watch tonight. Dana, good evening to you.
Good evening, Aaron. And as you said, the president is at Camp David, but before he left, he made clear that there could be more casualties ahead in the days to come in this war. And just as they did at the Pentagon, at the White House, they try to retaliate against suggestions that the war isn't going as planned.
Against this enemy, we will accept no outcome except complete victory.
Capping a week of public appearances to rally support and manage expectations, the president used the megaphone of his post to send the message the war is on track.
The regime that once terrorized all of Iraq now controls a small portion of that country. Coalition troops continue their steady advance and are drawing near to Baghdad. We're inflicting severe damage on enemy forces.
Mr. Bush, speaking before war veterans at the White House, spoke of the brutality of the Iraqi regime towards prisoners of war and its own people, and promised Americans will soon liberate.
And we refuse to leave the Iraqi people in slavery under Saddam Hussein. When the war in Iraq is won, all who have joined this cause will be able to say to the Iraqi people, we were proud to fight for your freedom.
Day 9 of the conflict, a senior presidential aide says the commander-in-chief is irritated by, quote, silly reporter questions of a flawed battle plan, talk of a longer war ahead than anticipated, and constant television analysis.
We haven't been welcomed as liberators yet. We haven't quite got rid of Saddam Hussein yet.
The White House says Mr. Bush never put a timetable on this war and did prepare the nation in speeches like this one in October.
Military conflict could be difficult. An Iraqi regime faced with its own demise may attempt cruel and desperate measures.
But just before the war began, Vice President Cheney said it would be, quote, relatively quick, weeks rather than months. The White House today said that those comments should be put into context, that he also said that things could get complicated. And today, Aaron, a senior official, admitted that they were reluctant to prepare the nation in detail for what this war would perhaps have ahead, especially when they were still dealing with the diplomatic events. They were very reluctant to talk about the war. Aaron.
Dana, thank you. Dana Bash at the White House. We'll take a break here. We'll give you an update on the headlines, and then we'll also be joined tonight by Jeff Greenfield. We have much to do. We're glad you're with us. Our coverage continues in a moment.
Winning a gold medal in any field makes a bold statement. That's why we're proud to announce that Smart Balance buttery spreads have been judged the best tasting in the soft vegetable spread category by the American Tasting Institute. Smart Balance helps to improve the ratio of good to bad cholesterol with no trans fatty acids and no hydrogenated oil. It has the right balance of fats you want in your diet. Use Smart Balance buttery spreads, the sensational taste for healthy eating.
Dave. Larry, how is that Dell consolidation going?
TCO's down.
Uptime? Highly available. Great.
And you?
You know, we're still running a proprietary Unix-based system.
Right.
A Dell flexible solution with Dell PowerEdge servers and Intel Xeon processors can help manage your enterprise for less. Easy as Dell. Call or go online today.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Heidi Collins at CNN Center, and here is what's happening at this hour. Iraq managed to penetrate Kuwait's air defenses tonight, apparently firing a missile that hit the country's most popular shopping mall. It was empty at the time. 2 people were only slightly injured, though. The impact did shatter several windows. Experts suspect Iraq fired what's known as a Chinese silkworm missile, which flies too low to be shot down. More huge explosions rocked Baghdad, and it appears the target was Iraq's information ministry. Iraqi officials also claim Allied forces struck a residential neighborhood and killed more than 50 civilians. The U.S. military says it targets only military sites and has accused Iraq of placing those sites in residential areas. 5 U.S. servicemen wounded on the battlefield in Iraq are back on home soil. They arrived at the Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Washington, D.C. today with a variety of war wounds. In other news now, Greek officials say the hijacker of a Turkish Airlines Airbus has surrendered and is in custody. The plane, carrying 196 passengers and 8 crew members, was hijacked shortly after takeoff from Istanbul. Greek officials have identified the hijacker as a male student thought to be a Turkish national. And here's a welcome distraction during a time of war, the national pastime. The Cincinnati Reds tonight opened the brand new Great American Ballpark with an exhibition game against the Cleveland Indians. Baseball's regular season opening day is Sunday. And Aaron, I have to tell you, they're saying that the ballpark is nice, but the home team needs work. They lost 6-1.
Doesn't count till it counts, though.
That's right.
Still spring training.
That's true.
Thank you. It's baseball season already, my goodness. Thank you, Heidi, very much. More now on the president and the war, what he's saying, what the public is hearing. Jeff Greenfield joins us from New York tonight. Jeff, it's good to have you. I actually have there's no theme in this, in at least the things on my list today. Let me start with the Secretary of Defense, though, because there is certain truth, I think, to his saying today that this intensive media coverage has these incredible highs and these lows and these highs and these lows, and they can happen in a period of a day or a half a day sometimes.
We are now, I think, about to see the 3rd or 4th mood swing in these 9 days. The poo-pooing of the gloom has already begun, and he is on this point absolutely right. It is one of the consequences of living in an era of instantaneous information. Everything gets compressed, and I would suggest all of us, the political people, the retired generals, the active armed forces people, and Lord knows the media, know the steps. We know the questions to ask, not months after a war starts, but days. It occurred to me, Aaron, that during the Vietnam War, we would watch the evening news at 6:30 or 7 o'clock, and the next piece of information we would get were in the morning papers the next day. Right? No CNN, no C-SPAN, Lord knows no World Wide Web with the bloggers posting all during the night, no talk radio. And so what happens is that by day 3, you're asking the questions that the Vietnam correspondents were asking about a year and a half after the escalation. And it is truly astonishing. And, to realize that in World War II, for the first 6 months of that war, as I said before, there was nothing but bad news. German U-boats sinking American ships within sight of the coast, the Japanese sweeping through Asia. What would have happened if we'd had this kind of coverage of the Second World War? I can't imagine it.
The president has, in the last 3 days, the president was at the Pentagon 3 days ago. Yesterday he was down at CENTCOM, Central Command. Today he was talking to a veterans group. The president is surrounding himself in some ways to help get the message out, which is both political. This is a question. Is it both political and strategic in a sense in terms of maintaining the country's optimism?
Yeah, I think, to be fair, it's political, if I can say this with a small p. That is, it's not political geared to the 2004 election. But I think that this White House really remembers what can happen to a president when the country turns against or gets suspicious or gets dubious about a war. I saw one piece, again, 7 days after the war, raising the famous phrase, credibility gap. That was a phrase that the former UN ambassador Arthur Goldberg coined around 1965 or 1966 to talk about the gap between, the growing gap between the American public and the president. I think any notion that the public thinks the president or the administration isn't leveling with them is considered political nitroglycerin, highly dangerous, and the White House, Lord knows, does not want to be in that position. I would also suggest that I think it was pretty striking to watch the president and Tony Blair at that joint press conference, because a lot of people who don't like the president were pointing out, that which is now an old chestnut about, well, here's Tony Blair. He grew up in the House of Commons. He's a master on his feet of the spontaneous, unrehearsed debate. And here's the president who didn't look as eloquent. I think the White House wants the president to be using that bully pulpit and to be seen not only as the man in charge of the war, but somebody who can explain the point of the war.
Is this a time when the president, perhaps not this week literally, but is this a time when the president can use his popularity? I think the poll number had it at about 64 or 65, somewhere in there, to get other things, domestic things through Congress? Or is the country so focused on the war now, in part because of the media, that that's the only story and the only piece of business?
Well, if that were true, you can't prove it by what's happened on the domestic front. Not that anybody's paying a whole lot of attention, but you did have his tax cut in half because 3 Republican senators defected, and there was an argument being made, don't walk away from the president at this time. Drilling in the Arctic Preserve has been defeated, and he can't get Judge Estrada confirmed, but he can't break that filibuster. So I really don't think that there's much of a connection. I don't think that we're seeing a lot of that, and if they were trying it, it doesn't seem to have had much impact. The other part about that is you go back to 1991, George Bush the elder, I guess that's what we have to call him, Bush the first, the father, riding on the wave of a victory. Remember victory parades through downtown New York and Washington, 91% approval ratings. Maybe if this George Bush winds up with that result, because it's a more politically focused White House, they will then try to leverage that popularity and that approval to a big domestic fight. But as of now, I think the war's got everybody's attention.
It certainly does ours. Thank you. I think all of ours for a while. Yet, Jeff, thank you. Jeff Greenfield. We wait for our embedded reporters to phone in, file for us, and we're expecting more of that. We'll talk more about the shape of the battlefield. A lot of things still ahead. Short break first. Our coverage continues in a moment.
CNN Tomorrow, the dangers coalition troops face as they await their next orders on the next American Morning, CNN Tomorrow, 7 a.m. Eastern.
The Jewelry Exchange is a direct diamond importer and has their factory in full view. The Jewelry Exchange has thousands of diamonds, most with GIA or EGL certs, laser inscribed and guaranteed the lowest price. We have thousands of mountings to choose from, and your diamond is then set while you watch. Certified 1-carat ISI diamonds are only $2,900 and 1-carat solitaires are $599. Our new high-end cabinets have hundreds of rare high-end items. You can't beat our deals. Buy factory direct and save. The Jewelry Exchange in Burlingame.
It's March Madness, and Antioch Dodge takes the court against Antioch Chrysler Jeep. 0% APR financings all over the board. Antioch Dodge takes the lead with 03 Durangos up to $8,000 off, and $10,500 off a 2002 Dodge Ram 1500 4x4. Antioch Chrysler Jeeps coming on strong with low prices like a 2003 PT Cruiser for only $13,888. Shop acres of new cars and trucks with factory warranties of 7 years and 70,000 miles. Get into March Madness at Antioch Dodge Chrysler Jeep off Highway 4 at Summersville Road.
CNN, the most trusted name in news.
Talk a bit more about the shape of the war, or the strategy, the underlying strategy in all of this, because that seems to be one of the issues so prominently on the table right now. We're joined from our Washington bureau by author and military historian, retired Colonel Walter Boyne. Nice to see you, sir.
Nice to see you.
Do you have is it your concern here that the plan itself is too timid in its approach?
No, I'm concerned that we didn't really recognize that some other things have intervened since 1991. We came out of 1991 with a conceit that our technology would be such that we could fight a war without casualties and without inflicting many casualties. That's really quite a stretch, and it played into the hands of the enemy, because now if an ordinary set of casualties occurs, something that's in part of every war, they play it up as an atrocity. We made a mistake. I think that we should really announce that we're going to fight this war as we fight all wars, and as all wars have always been fought through history with the utmost vigor, and that if casualties occur, we regret them, we'll try to avoid them, but it's not something that we wish to be placed on trial for.
When you say casualties, you're referring to civilian casualties, are you not?
Yes, to collateral damage and to civilian casualties. Every commander in the field, if he's faced with troops that are advancing on him with women and children, has got to decide, does he attack them or does he risk his own troops? It's a tough decision to pass down. Everybody will make postmortems of whatever event occurs, and I think we've put ourselves in really an artificial position. It's a war. It's not a video game, and it's not a game of politeness. We should fight the war as we need to with utter vigor.
That's the theoretical. Now I want to take it to the practical. Can you give me a practical example of where the coalition is not executing the war in the way that you think it would be best executed?
Well, we had the incidents in which we had people killed because they were sort of sandbagged by what we now call thugs, but they're guerrillas, no matter whether you give them the credit of being a Czechoslovakian guerrilla against the Germans or a Russian guerrilla against the Germans. They're guerrilla fighters. And they have another thing going for them that we haven't really factored into the equation, too. Since 9/11, there's really been somewhat of a holy war declared against us, and I think that we're not only perceived as invaders, but we're also perceived as infidels. And so if you have an Iraqi brought up in a system in which he's been led to believe that Saddam Hussein is, correct in everything, and that he must believe what Saddam Hussein has said, and if he's got a guy who has a gun against his head, it's pretty hard to tear him away. I think once we win the battle, and we will win it, once we bring in the humanitarian aid and we bring in the hospitals and they do see that we are of good intent, then things will change. But on the battlefield, I think that we ought to be very, very circumspect about admitting the enemy close to the camp, or admitting them with any idea that they might possibly be soldiers. I'd much rather keep them out forcibly if necessary.
The argument, of course, is that you win the war and lose the peace, that these images that are played across the Arab world and across Europe and elsewhere, that while you undoubtedly can go take Baghdad, in the long run the argument is made, you do yourself more harm than good. Obviously, if I hear you, you're saying, look, let's do first things first here.
Well, not only that, we've already lost that battle. There's no way in the world we could come in with nothing but Hershey candy bars to hand out to everybody, and no Arab newspaper would change a thing. We've lost that war. The only way we can survive is to win this war in a way that we don't have to engage in another one in Syria or in some other country. And also then do a marvelous job on the peace, really do, you know, a Marshall Plan Plus so that we get them back in the world. Then gradually, only gradually, will we ever get them to begin to like us. I think it's very much essential that they respect us first and then learn to like us later. We're not going to make them like us as we come in.
Final quick question. Do you think there's any chance that the generals or the politicians involved in creating the war plan are going to have a change of heart and go the direction you're advocating they go?
Well, let me ask you this. If you find that you have 3 or 4 Iraqi divisions in Baghdad suburbs and they have chemical weapons, they probably won't have a choice but to do as I suggest.
It's nice to talk to you, sir. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Right.
Interesting conversation. CNN's Bob Franken, excuse me, is embedded at a forward air base, and he joins us by the video phone. Excuse me, Bob. In Iraq, what are you able to report today?
Well, we're going to have to tread very carefully, but of course we are able to report that this is going to become a major staging area for the A-10s. We've become very familiar with that plane and its major role in the protection of the ground forces. And this base, which is 150 miles closer to the action, is going to be a place now where the A-10s and other aircraft operate. With me now is the person who is here coordinating. He is the A-10 commander. This is Lieutenant Colonel Baha. I have to explain that they only want their flight names known. They are not supposed to be identified personally. Tell me about what's going to be happening in the next day or so.
Well, we're coming up shortly. We're here to set up for A-10 operations out of here. We're looking to move forward and press the war north, and having A-10s in the fight closer is going to certainly be able to support the Army and Marines and take out critical enemy assets that will oppose them.
Now, is this going to be a place where they'll actually locate, or is it going to be a staging area, a refueling area?
For right now, we're looking at refueling and building up in the future. No timeline set for that, but things are moving quickly.
The advantage being that it's 150 miles closer to everything, right?
That's affirmative. We can give us a lot more loiter time in the area and allow us to employ our weapons.
You're in addition to being the commander, you are an A-10 pilot and are flying missions here. Tell me about the most recent ones.
Just a few days ago, I was actually in this area here. As you know, this is one of the hot spots down in the south, and we were over here working, taking out a few of the tanks and bunkers and some of the various targets that were causing problems at that time. So,
can you describe the actual mission, what you go through, what you went through in that?
The mission itself, you know, there's a lot of planning going on. That particular day, we were working with some of the ground assets out there. They were talking our eyes onto some targets that they felt were critical for their mission, and then we go support them and by taking those 2 tanks in particular, and then a couple of bunker storage areas full of munitions that they wanted taken out.
And you go in your famous dive. What is that like?
Well, flying is a lot of fun, but you don't think too much about it.